Part 1 for December 2nd, 2025. Laurel Hill Cemetery, in the beginning, the first 20 years. When he died in 1832, Scottish novelist and poet Sir Walter Scott was the second most read author in the English language after William Shakespeare. In 1816, he had written a story called Old Mortality as part of his series of historical writings known as the Waverley Novels. It centers on the character of Old Mortality, a real-life figure named Robert Patterson, 1T, whose tireless dedication to preserving the memory of Scottish Covenanters made him a legendary emblem of remembrance. The Covenanters were a 17th century Scottish movement that opposed the Stuart monarchy's efforts to impose Anglican practices on the Church of Scotland. They favored Presbyterian church governance over royal-appointed bishops, and they signed covenants, most notably the National Covenant of 1638, that asserted religious independence and rejected the king's reforms. Their resistance led to decades of conflict, including the Bishops' War and involvement in the English Civil War. Following Charles II's restoration in 1660, Covenanters faced severe persecution, especially during the Killing Time, 1679 to 1688, which became a symbol of their struggle for religious freedom. In Scott's tale, Old Mortality is depicted as a humble stonemason. He wanders through the Scottish countryside to seek out neglected graves of Covenanters. With his chisel and mallet, he recarves faded inscriptions and restores headstones to ensure that the sacrifices of these martyrs are not forgotten by future generations. His only companion on these solitary journeys is his pony, described as sturdy and enduring, who faithfully carries Old Mortality from graveyard to graveyard, braving the elements and the rough terrain of Scotland. Forgive my attempts at a Scottish accent. It usually goes into Irish very, very quickly. This is supposed to be Old Mortality. I'm quoting Old Mortality from his story. My hours are like the ears of the latter harvest, and your days are yet in the spring. And yet you may be gathered into the garner of mortality before me. For the sickle of death cuts down the green as oft as the ripe, and there is a colour in your cheek that, like the bud of the rose, serveth oft to hide the worm of corruption. Wherefore labour as one who knoweth not when his master calleth. And if it be my lot to return to this village after ye are gane hame to your ain place, these auld withered hands will frame a stane of a memorial that your name will not perish from among the people. Well, less than a year after Laurel Hill Cemetery opened in 1836, Old Mortality was waiting for its guests. Cemetery records show that the sculptor James Thom received $1,000 on June 27, 1836, and the statues were delivered April 11th the following year. The unfortunate pony had been severely damaged in transit. He had to be replaced. Thom went on to make his reputation sculpting characters from Scottish literature. It is his bust that you see in the right rear corner. The allegory of Old Mortality's pony had resonated with the founders, and they knew it would do the same with visitors to Laurel Hill. The image of a humble figure who tended to forgotten graves represented the cemetery's mission to honor both famous and ordinary lives. The new cemetery owners also realized that for the people they were trying to attract, no explanation of the statue group would be necessary. For the others, they wrote this: As Old Mortality loved to repair defaced tombstones, so the originators of the plan of the cemetery hope it may be the study of their successors to keep the place in perpetual repair and to transmit it undefaced to a distant date. For nearly 2 centuries, the allegoric Old Mortality and his pony have remained the greeters at Laurel Hill. The suite of statues encourages visitors to consider the importance of remembrance, the value of historical awareness, and the practical efforts that preserve the narratives of previous generations. This allegory has also shaped cemetery culture more broadly. It really highlights the role of cemeteries as spaces for both commemoration and education. And it all started because of a Quaker named John J. Smith, 1798-1881. In late 1835, he wrote in his diary, "The city of Philadelphia has been increasing so rapidly of late years that the living population has multiplied beyond the means of an accommodation for the dead, a circumstance which has forcibly impressed my mind, and in connection with the fact, on recently visiting Friend's graveyard in Cherry Street, I found it impossible to designate the resting place of a darling daughter, determined me to endeavor to procure for the citizens a suitable, neat, and orderly location for a rural cemetery, where each individual or family might have a lot in fee simple to bury their dead." Okay, couple of things. Cherry Street, also called Sassafras Street. The western burial ground was located between 16th and 17th. Cherry and Reese. That land is now home of Friends Select School. In the 1830s, this land was in the wilderness of West Philadelphia. Also, there are several accounts of this story that have Smith making the discovery at the eastern burial ground. That's the one we know at Arch Street Meeting House. Indeed, there are thousands of Quakers buried in unmarked graves in that one square block. But the accounting that I give about the western burial ground came straight from his diary. Now, despite his Quaker background, with its emphasis on simplicity, John J. Smith's approach to burial practices diverged from traditional customs and aligned more with the evolving perspectives of many Philadelphians. While the Society of Friends discouraged elaborate mourning, lengthy funeral processions, and ornate grave markers, a broader shift in attitudes towards death rituals was emerging within the city. Smith was, of course, unable to alter the theological stance of his denomination, so he sought as a private citizen to address the concern of caring for the deceased. In other words, he figured it would be easier to ask forgiveness in retrospect than to ask permission in advance. And in November of 1835, John J. Smith and 5 other laymen established the Laurel Hill Cemetery Company. The group then acquired 32 acres of land, a former county estate and Catholic boarding school located 3 miles upstream from Philadelphia along the scenic Schuylkill River. It was purchased by the far-traveled Nathan Dunn, who I will discuss at length in part 3 of this podcast. Remember that in 1836, Philadelphia was still a 2-square-mile rectangle. It ran from river to river and from Vine to South, which was then called Mulberry. I have heard an urban legend that William Penn named the streets for trees in order of their hardness, but there is no truth to that. And for reasons no one can explain, he left out the oak tree, which was a common name in other colonial cities. Now, located so far from the hustle of the city, the founders thought that there was no way that the city would encroach on the cemetery. After all, in 1836, the streets above 2nd Street were unpaved. Carriages were extremely rare. You had to be a rich person to own a carriage, and to have gone further than 4th or 5th Street would have been most impractical in the winter and early spring weather in those unpaved roads. In the 3-mile-per-hour world of 1836, a trip to the cemetery would take more than an hour on foot, horse, or steam ferry. Then another hour or so to come back. Religious leaders protested. They would have to give up half a day for a single funeral. And some ministers were also suspicious of a secular cemetery. They felt that death had always come under the purview of religion. Well, Laurel Hill would not be the first cemetery in Philadelphia that was free from clerical and religious control. As early as 1825, private citizens were running 6 cemeteries in the city. Ronaldson Cemetery, founded in 1827, was an elegantly landscaped graveyard that served for many years as the model necropolis for the city, even though it was located south of the city limits at Washington near 9th and Shippen. City limits, remember, were at South Street. Even prominent Philadelphia churches like Christ Church could not offer much more to their parishioners. They, too, needed to buy land away from the church to bury the dead of their congregation. The owners and managers of private cemeteries assumed that Philadelphians preferred to be buried not with their fellow Episcopalians or Presbyterians or Quakers, but with others of similar social and philosophical outlook. And although you will hear Laurel Hill called a WASP cemetery, that is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant cemetery, the owners really cared more about the color of your skin and the content of your wallet than the beliefs in your soul. By the 1820s, demand for cadavers among the nation's 20-or-so medical schools was escalating rapidly. It was here that dissection was especially widespread and a source of national prestige. We had some of the best anatomists in the country, Pancoast, Walker. By 1824, the year of the founding of Thomas Jefferson Medical School, this system showed signs of strain. William E. Horner, who taught anatomy at the University of Pennsylvania, was forced to decline a request from his Harvard counterpart, pointing apologetically to, quote, the influx of students at a time when the town had been so uncommonly healthy. Statistically, of course, that was not true. From the perspective of medical school instructors, cheaper, more secure modes of burial only made matters worse. Public officials and their employees gladly accepted bribes to facilitate access to the city's two public burial grounds. In his 2002 publication, A Traffic of Dead Bodies, medical historian Michael Sappol, that's S-A-P-P-O-L, showed that in 1829, a harvest of some 450 bodies was shared by local medical schools. And yet, even those repositories were exhaustible. A second threat to the supply chain came from public sentiment. When state legislators considered a bill that would have increased the penalties for body snatching, local doctors reacted angrily and raised the specter of, quote, an end to the medical prominence of Philadelphia, end quote. The city's leading anatomists quietly reached a cadaver-sharing agreement soon afterwards, but supplies remained scarce, and eventually Philadelphia came to depend on New York for its anatomical material. Church authorities worried that burials in cemeteries that lacked proper religious rites and oversight potentially jeopardized the spiritual well-being of the deceased and the final location of the soul. Then again, this was also at a time when there was much debate about such things as whether people who are deaf could enter the kingdom of heaven, since they had not heard the word of God. They also feared that removing burial from the church context would weaken communal ties that had been forged through shared religious practice. There was apprehension that secular cemeteries promoted a view of death and remembrance disconnected from religious meaning, and that they favored aesthetic or civic interpretations over spiritual ones. Finally, some religious leaders suspected that secular cemeteries might encourage religious indifference or even irreligion by diminishing the role of clergy and religious ceremonies in funeral practices. But not all religious leaders opposed secular cemeteries. Over time, some adapted. They performed religious services at grave sites within the new cemetery, and religious communities sometimes established their own sections within larger than non-sectarian burial grounds. Many of them chose to be buried in these cemeteries rather than one affiliated with the church. The rural cemetery movement emerged from changing views on death in 18th century Europe. Despite having been named for a Catholic priest, Paris's Père Lachaise opening in 1804 set a precedent for burial parks independent of religious oversight. Previously, crowded churchyards and somber epitaphs dominated. Now, cemeteries were seen as places for reflection, commemoration. Père Lachaise Cemetery features winding paths, lush vegetation. It offered visitors uplifting experiences, scenic views. It became not just a place for reflection on mortality, but a destination cemetery to admire its sculptures and its landscaping. Its influence spread to Britain and the United States in the 1820s and 30s, and reformers advocated for private cemeteries in natural settings that celebrated civic and domestic virtues. Former Mayor Benjamin Richards, one of Laurel Hill's 4 founders, visited Père Lachaise and was deeply impressed by its beauty. You will hear more about Benjamin in Section 4 of the podcast. Americans created the term rural cemetery to describe this type of landscape. Now, by 1812, the Philadelphia City Council had forbidden further burials in the public squares. Remember that in William Penn's concept of a green country town, 1683, he mapped out land for 5 dedicated squares. The 2 easternmost, closest to the Delaware River, became burial grounds. Northeast Square, we now call it Franklin Square, served as the potter's field for Philadelphia, and somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 people are buried there. All religions, all races, all colors, enslaved and free. Southeast Square, what we now call Washington Square, located behind Independence Hall, contains the bodies of an estimated 20,000 people, yellow fever victims, Revolutionary War soldiers of all sides, prisoners from the nearby Walnut Street Jail, paupers and strangers. That's also the location for the tomb of the unknown Revolutionary War soldier, who may be American, British, Hessian, or Native American. And if you're curious, the northern squares of Logan and Franklin are slightly larger when compared to the 8.6 acres of the southern squares, Washington and Rittenhouse. The term Potter's Field can be traced to the Christian Bible, specifically the New Testament. Matthew 27, verses 3 through 10, after Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, he returned the money to the chief priests and elders. The priests decided it could not be put into the temple treasury because it was blood money. Instead, they used the coins to buy a field to bury strangers in. This field had previously belonged to a potter and was thus called the Potter's Field. Potters typically use land with clay deposits to make their works. However, once the clay is exhausted, the land is unsuitable for farming or building and considered of little value, but perfect for cemeteries. The field could be repurposed as a burial ground, particularly for those who lacked family or means for a proper burial. By 1830, before the consolidation, Philadelphia's population had jumped to 161,410 people crammed into its 2 square miles. All of them would eventually die. The city banned all burials within its limits in 1816. Well, cremation was still taboo. Aquamation was decades away. All these people needed a place for their body to spend eternity. The primary source of the restriction against cremation in 19th century America was, no surprise, religious. Protestant and Catholic traditions emphasized bodily resurrection and the sanctity of the body. The prevailing doctrine held that the body should be preserved intact for resurrection at the second coming. This made cremation, a process that destroyed the body, unacceptable and even sacrilegious. Additionally, cremation was seen as a practice associated with pagan cultures or foreign religions. This further alienated it from mainstream American society. The idea of burning the dead was associated with the Greeks, the Romans, or Eastern religions, which were outside the moral and spiritual norms of Christian America. It wasn't until the centennial year of 1876 that the first crematorium was even built in the United States. It was in Washington, Pennsylvania, the home of Washington and Jefferson University, just outside of Pittsburgh. So, a question I often get: was Laurel Hill East founded as a Christian cemetery? Yes and no. Although the exact percentage of the United States population that was Christian in the 1830s is not precisely documented, historical estimates indicate that Christianity was overwhelmingly dominant, and upwards of 90% of the population identified as Christian, primarily Protestant, with smaller numbers of Catholic and other Christian denominations. Non-Christian religious adherents and those with no religious affiliation made up a very small fraction of the population. As you wander Laurel Hill's grounds today, you will see a lot of traditional Christian religious symbolism: crucifixes, Celtic crosses, archangels, putos. But you will also see the occasional Star of David and several languages from traditionally non-Christian countries like China, India, Persia. Unlike many secular cemeteries, Laurel Hill did not have a consecrated area set aside for those who wished one, but they would sell property to a church, which could then consecrate their own area and use it for their own parishioners. Currently, Christians make up about a third of the population of the earth. 31% is the percentage that I saw. In the 21st century, Laurel Hill West in Ballackinwood actually has a handful of Jewish sections and a large plot of Korean immigrants. If you go to Westminster, next door, there's a huge Vietnamese section, there's a huge Chinese section, there's a huge Persian section. Even off-brand Christians were welcome. Quakerism, formerly known as the Religious Society of Friends, originated in mid-17th century England. Its founder, George Fox, and early adherents sought a purer, more direct Christian faith. They emphasized personal experience of God rather than formal sacraments and clergy. The movement arose within a Christian context, and its early followers considered themselves Christians, but they were reforming the faith. Most Quakers still identify as Christian, but they center their beliefs on the teachings and example of Jesus Christ. However, over time, the movement has diversified, and some branches in the United States and the United Kingdom have become more universalist or non-theistic, and they emphasize values like peace, integrity, and equality without explicit reference to Christian doctrine. Swedenborgianism, or the New Church, was founded in England in 1787. It has two essential doctrines. The first, there is one God, Jehovah, who incarnated as Jesus so that he may redeem mankind. The second is an obligation to live in according to his commandments. Many Swedenborgians are interred at Laurel Hill East, including the two foremost preachers in the country, Reverend Benjamin Fisk Barrett and the Reverend Richard Newton. I plan to do a complete podcast on the Swedenborgian Church sometime next year, I hope. Unitarianism began in 16th and 17th century Europe as a Christian movement that rejected the Trinity but affirmed God's unity and Jesus' humanity. Initially a Christian reform group, Unitarians later embraced broader spiritual beliefs, including secular humanism, especially in the United States. Today, Unitarian Universalist congregations welcome people of any faith or none, and the movement is generally not considered strictly Christian, though some still identify as such. Remember Mary Channing Wister? I talked about her in an early podcast. Owen Wister's wife and granddaughter of the religion's founder, William Ellery Channing, was strongly anti-Christian. She even avoided hiring Irish or French staff, nursemaids, maids, to prevent secret baptisms of her children. So what was this land that Smith and his partners had purchased? Between 1797 and 1824, this 32-acre parcel had been the county seat of merchant Joseph Sims. It was known as Laurel Hill, or simply Laurel. There was a porticoed Georgian mansion, several outbuildings of unknown dates. Sims' estate lay along the Ridge Road, one of the two main arteries that ran northwest from Philadelphia. The other, of course, was Germantown Pike. In 1812, the road was maintained as a privately owned turnpike. After 1824, Laurel exchanged hands several times. First, it was rented out as a farm and a tavern, and then as a Catholic boarding school, Laurel Hill College, run by the Reverend Jeremiah Kiley. A room in the mansion served as school chapel. This short-lived venture ended when Father Kiley sold the land to two other priests. They are the ones who sold it to Nathan Dunn, who represented the Laurel Hill Consortium. Only the 20 acres lying west of Ridge Avenue were used for burials. The 12 acres across the pike were then leased to appropriate clients, florists, marble carvers. Local merchant John Sherwood rented the land, had to operate under certain restrictions. Sherwood engages not to sell wines, spirituous liquors, ice cream, or refreshments of any kind, and not to keep any animals, statues, paintings, or other things as shows for money. He engages not to obstruct the view of Laurel Hill or the entrance on approaching it by the summer road, usually called the Lamb Tavern Road, either in erecting buildings or the growing of trees. The Lamb Tavern intrigued me. It was built in the first decade of the 19th century between the Falls Road and Islington Lane in the East Falls section of the city. In its day, it was famous hostelry, a rendezvous for many fashionable coaching and sleighing parties from the city proper. It was also a great haunt for actors, lawyers, and other professional men. Edwin Forrest, the actor Edwin Forrest, was particularly fond of the Lamb Tavern. The building itself was demolished sometime in the 1890s. And when it came time to design the property for a cemetery, there was an informal competition. Noted Philadelphia architect William Strickland, who had already designed the Big Three of the Second Bank, Merchants Exchange, and the Second U.S. Mint, was thought to be a shoo-in, and he submitted his design with an Egyptian Revival gateway. Although he is immured in the wall of the Capitol building in Nashville, Strickland has a cenotaph at Laurel Hill East. The other name architect, Thomas Ustick Walter, architect of the Capitol Dome of the U.S. Capitol Building and Girard College, and buried at Laurel Hill East, also submitted an Egyptian Revival plan. The selection committee surprised and shocked almost everyone when they chose a young, 26-year-old, recent Scottish immigrant. He came to the country in 1831, John Notman, for the job. This was his first known commission. He had immigrated as a carpenter until this opportunity came along. Now, Notman's major contribution to the project was the gatehouse, a Roman Doric creation modeled loosely on a triumphant arch. It still stands. Earlier this year of 2025, it completed a massive renovation thanks to the generosity of the Dietrich Foundation and other contributors. Notman used a plan that had been proposed but never used by Henry E. Kendall for Kensal Green Cemetery near London, which had opened in 1833. There is a copy of this in the library company with what appear to be Notman's pencil marks on the drawing. In June 1836, Polson's Daily Advertiser, a local newspaper, announced, "There is now to be seen at the Exchange a very beautiful picture drawn by Mr. Walter and designed by Mr. Notman, the architect, of the entrance adopted by the company to the new rural cemetery at Laurel Hill near Philadelphia." The next day, the same newspaper politely reported that a plan for the entrance, not entirely correct in its proportions, was handed to Mr. Walter, who, as a friend, politely agreed to remodel it without giving an opinion of the merit of the plan. Walter's account books show that he received a sizable payment for his suggestions. The surveyor was Philip M. Price, and John J. Smith personally undertook the plantings. So technically, the oldest section of Laurel Hill, that 20 acres, was designed by four men: John Notman, John J. Smith, Thomas Ustick Walter, and Mr. Price. The first interment took place on the 19th of October, 1836. That's less than a year from the inception of the plan. The individual first laid in the cemetery was Mercy Carlyle, a friend, age 67, wife of Abraham Carlyle. She had visited the grounds a few weeks previously, and then in feeble health expressed her decided wish to be interred under the group of four large pine trees, now enclosed by granite and iron railing near the center of the plot. The cost to be buried at Laurel Hill was outrageous. 50 cents a square foot. That's twice what you would pay in the city. That's 6 times what you would pay at a mutual lot. Premium locations were half again as much, 75 cents a square foot. That means even a simple, single 8x10 plot would cost $40. That is more than a month's wages for the average laborer. Despite this price, 2 years after opening, nearly half of those original 800 plots had been sold. Lot owners were deed holders, not shareholders. They had to abide by certain non-negotiable rules. Lots could only be resold under extenuating circumstances and with management's consent. This precluded speculation. 2 feet was the maximum height for perimeter walls, 4 feet 6 inches for fencing and shrubbery. Tree planting without prior approval, forbidden. And certain burial customs, especially leaving a raised mound of earth over the grave, was a definite no-no. There were very few direct references to social groups, but the regulations did expressly forbid the interment of black people. As for visiting, well, the public was welcome to tour the premises on foot with a ticket obtained from the business offices in Philadelphia, and then a 4-mile walk to the cemetery. Saddle horses were barred. Only lot owners could enter with their carriages. On Sunday, which was the main day of leisure for the working class, the gates were closed to all but funeral goers and lot holders. Quote, "The managers inform persons who may wish to obtain lots in this cemetery that they will have the ground they purchase secured to them and their families and heirs for a burial place forever, and for the burial of such other white persons as they may choose to admit, provided such is free of charge and without any compensation." Again, cutting down on speculation. I'll mention here that at least 2 of the plots, I'm sure there are more than this, but 2 of the plots I know in North that are still active were purchased in 1839. The Wetherill plot and the Bolin plot were both purchased in 1839, and they are still active plots. The Wetherill family in Chestnut Hill, the Bolin family in Villanova. Visitors to the cemetery almost had a massive pyramid to admire. Founder Frederick Brown called for construction of a gigantic monument in the style of Caius Cestius, a tomb at Rome's Protestant cemetery. It was to be in honor of astronomer and mathematician David Rittenhouse, navigational equipment inventor Thomas Godfrey, naturalist Alexander Wilson, and all-around scientist Thomas Say. Fortunately, this monstrosity was never built. Likewise for a larger-than-life-size statue of George Washington, which had been carved by Old Mortality sculptor James Thom. It stood by the front gate for a few years, but it was determined to be inappropriate and was sold elsewhere. Sections A through C and E through I were receiving interments by the end of 1836. L&D joined the list the following year, and in 1840, St. John's Lutheran Evangelical Church acquired the new section O for their parishioners. That became their sacred ground. Lots in sections M, R, S, and T Circle were available by 1853 as the cemetery became more crowded. When a financial downturn came in 1837, the owners saw their investment at risk. So they decided to advertise by using celebrity corpses, people who had been buried elsewhere that were reinterred at Laurel Hill at the expense of the owners in order to attract more customers. Charles Thompson was one of the first. I told his story in All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 68, Friends of Thomas Jefferson Part 2. Military men had a particular cache. First came Hugh Mercer, 1726-1777, Revolutionary War general who'd been buried at Christ Church. Naval captains Isaac Hull, 1773-1843, and Alexander Murray, 1755-1821, soon followed. In June of 2026, expect a podcast about the celebrity corpses, Thomas Godfrey, Isaac Hull, and a few other of our meandering cadavers. Less than a year after the cemetery opened, recently turned 18-year-old British Princess Alexandrina Victoria of Kent ascended to become Queen Victoria, beginning the 63-year-long Victorian era, which lasted until her death. The rise of obelisks started early. Obelisks originated in ancient Egypt, where they were erected as monumental symbols dedicated to the sun god Ra. Egyptians believed that obelisks connected the earth to the heavens and served as a bridge between the mortal world and the divine. The shape was thought to represent a ray of sunlight, further emphasizing the connection to the sun and to the afterlife. When used as a burial marker, the obelisk carries several layers of symbolism. The upward-pointing form of the obelisk symbolizes the soul's journey toward the heavens, the hope of eternal life. Its imposing and enduring structure serves as lasting tribute to the deceased, signifies respect, remembrance, and the solid, unyielding stone represents strength and the enduring legacy of the person being memorialized. June 17, 1825, the Marquis de Lafayette had laid the cornerstone in Boston for the Bunker Hill Memorial 50 years after the battle. And when the construction stalled in the 1830s, Sarah Josepha Hale, then an influential editor of the popular magazine Ladies Magazine, later she was Godey's Ladies Book, of course, she began a public campaign to revive the effort. Hale wrote articles and editorials that urged women across America to contribute to the monument's completion and emphasize the importance of national memory and patriotism. She argued that women's involvement in such civic projects was both honorable and necessary. Her campaign was successful, and the 221-foot-tall Bunker Hill obelisk was completed in 1843. Hale is, of course, interred at Laurel Hill East in Section X. That same year, Laurel Hill owners exhorted lot owners to embrace recent changes in taste. It has been the frequent remark of visitors, our own citizens as well as strangers, that a monotony already begins to be apparent in the style and form of the improvements. Obelisk succeeds obelisk with only slight variation, and if this is continued, we shall see in time too dull and uniformity, they used and uniformity to strike the mind with agreeable sentiments. This may be obviated by a little inquiry before ordering a monument, and by not always taking the advice of the stonemason. This was a losing cause. In Washington, D.C., construction of the Washington Monument started in 1848, but it was not completed until 40 years later. This explains the preponderance of obelisks in the central section of Laurel Hill East, which opened in 1861. Construction on the D.C. monument was suspended for 23 years, from 1854 to 1877, due to funding challenges, struggle for control over the Washington National Monument Society, religious arguments when the Pope sent a stone to be inserted, the American Civil War. Finally, it was completed in 1884. The internal ironwork, the knoll, the memorial stones were completed in 1888. And as metaphor and allegory were allowed in the cemetery, the need for a lengthy epitaph diminished with an obelisk. Now, John J. Smith, who is subject of the second part of the podcast, pushed the work of local stoneworkers, and in his Guide to Laurel Hill, he advertised the services of Notman, Walter, and Strickland. In addition to a final resting place and a sculpture garden, Laurel Hill also served as an early arboretum. There was an article in Godey's Ladies Book in 1844 that reported, "The planting of the cemetery has received the most sedulous care of Mr. Smith, whose personal attention on the spot has been unremitted for 7 years. The curator informs us that Mr. S. has planted with his own hands 2,400 trees, shrubs, and roots." In the 1844 manual, founder John J. Smith summed up his philosophy nicely. "The rural and ornate cemetery in the vicinity of the large city or town is the common ground upon which all parties can meet in forgiveness and harmony. It is the lap of the common mother which receives at last, in no unkind embrace, all her children, however widely sundered in their lives by the jarring controversies of their day." Knowing what we know now, one segment of the rules will make you wince. Quote, "Every precaution that can be taken where iron is decided on as the material to be used should be observed. Railings which expose the smallest number of joints or points of union should be selected. Their connection by means of screws, etc., where these are exposed so as to limit the moisture, cannot, of course, be expected to endure any great length of time. Every portion of the iron should be completely coated as soon as erected with lead paint, which should extend over and into every crack. After this has stood some time, another coat will be required, and the railing will probably then be preserved for several years without care or retouching. Put money in the pockets of the Wetherills and the Whartons, but there was all that lead paint." Smith recommended holly, if it can be procured, as the best permanent hedge. He warned against less than successful attempts with Chinese arborvitae. 2 things forbidden in the 19th century are welcome in the 21st century. Saddle horses and dogs were not admitted, and no refreshments or party carrying refreshments were permitted in the grounds. If you want to come with your horse or your dog and bring some popcorn, be our guest. Laurel Hill was not universally loved. Yale president and theologian Theodore Woolsey did not care for it at all. In 1847, he wrote in the quarterly magazine The New Englander, "Let a person go to Laurel Hill Cemetery in the spring, when the dogwood is in blossom, and the Judas tree, there indigenous, is covered with its red robe of flowers." Judas tree is a common name for a flowering tree, Cercis siliquastrum. Let him wander, as he cannot fail to do, along the banks overhanging the Schuylkill, watching perchance the little steamboat as it comes down the stream, or the cars and canal boats bringing their loads to the great city. The scene within may be lovely enough, for it is rather too far from Philadelphia for bare-legged children to be trundling their hoops there, whilst Irish maids are talking in knots, or for whiskered men to stroll down the alleys puffing their cigars, or for sentimental ladies to laugh and sigh there with equal want of simplicity. But though the scene may be lovely, is the impression solemn, in keeping with the sleeping place of mortal men? We do not believe that a solemn impression is made on any mind, but rather that the true and right feeling that ought to spring up from our nature when cultivated is repressed by the very beauties of the spot. These planted trees and walks, these views of the river, these iron settees inviting rest, draw away from the attention of the tombs, and the sum total of the impression carried away with it is that it's a very beautiful spot. Perhaps the thriving merchant with a young family, as he visits it, thinks it a genteel place and resolves to go to the directors to inquire about the price of a lot. Perhaps the sentimental damsel thinks she would like to be buried near such a river. At all events, whatever solemn impression may arise in a devout mind in spite of the place, the directors had little of it, or they would not have set up as the genius loci at the very entrance Tom's sandstone statue of Old Mortality, searching among the tombs for Covenanters' graves with his pony standing by. A pleasing composition, to be sure, but in effect so far below the requirements of the place that Venus weeping over the dead Adonis would be quite as appropriate. At present, in our new burial grounds, brotherhood in wealth seems to be the principle of admission. The poor must stand aloof and seek some less genteel place or burial. January 1844, the owners voted that the mansion had to come down, the one that was there when they bought the property. There was good burial space that was being taken up. The stone rubble was actually used to terrace the amphitheater in Section S leading down to the river, and they converted the basement into burial vaults. They used brick partitions and sold the lots. Between April and December of 1848, nearly 30,000 people entered the gates. It was also in the late 1840s that Ridge Avenue was properly graded and the Ridge Avenue rail line established. So now people didn't have to walk. Steamboats did ply their trade on the Schuylkill. Their main port was at the foot of Nicetown Lane. We now call that Hunting Park. After that, there was an unpleasant uphill walk of about a half a mile to get to the cemetery. The Nicetown section of Philadelphia, by the way, it has a name with an interesting historical origin. Contrary to what it might suggest, it's not simply an expression of the area's pleasantness. The name Nicetown is derived from the family name Deneus, N-E-U-S, or Nice, N-I-E-C-E. They were among the early settlers in that region in the late 17th and early 18th century. Hans Deneus, sometimes written as Hans Nice or Hans Deneus, a Mennonite immigrant from the German-speaking region of Europe, is credited as the namesake. Over time, the pronunciation and the spelling evolved into Nicetown instead of Nicetown or Newstown. June 14th, 1848, the cemetery expanded. The manager's agent paid $13,000 for the 27-acre estate called Harley. The owner was William Rawle, 1759-1836. He had served as United States District Attorney in Pennsylvania from 1791 to 1800. He founded the Rawle Law Offices in 1783, which evolved into Rawle and Henderson, the oldest law firm in the United States. He was the first chancellor of the Philadelphia Bar Association. He published several influential legal texts, including a view of the Constitution of the United States. He was the first to argue for secession in the United States. He was a Quaker and an abolitionist. He was a founder and a president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and president of the Maryland Society for Abolition. He argued cases before the Supreme Court of the United States in 1805 against the constitutionality of slavery. The Royal Reading Room at the Temple Law Library is named in his honor. Over the next few years, this land would be transformed into South Laurel Hill Cemetery, which opened for business in April 1849 as a separate entity to Laurel Hill North. The new property was a quarter-mile away, but that meant it was closer to the city. Plus, it had its own staff and its own entrance. The cemetery became landlocked. The city obtained the land south of the current property and set it aside as parkland. From the late 1830s onward, dozens of rural cemeteries spread across the American landscape. It was most apparent outside northeastern and midwestern cities, but it was not limited to these regions or to these cities, or just to cities. By 1849, this is 13 years after the opening of Laurel Hill Cemetery, there were nearly 20 rural cemeteries around Philadelphia. Monument, 1837, Woodlands, 1840, were followed by Franklin, 1840, Lebanon, 1849, Olive, 1849, Oddfellows, 1849, American Mechanic Cemetery, 1849, and Glenwood, 1850. Mount Vernon, across the street from Laurel Hill, did not open until 1856. It was in the city limits then, and after the consolidation, the city had no choice but to now allow bodies to be buried within the city limits, taking back that law they'd made back in 1816. In early 1855, Laurel Hill bought a 10-acre tract of land sandwiched between North Laurel Hill and the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad at the far north of the property. It was small, but was relatively flat. It really didn't require much landscaping to fit into Notman's plan. The prior owner, Frederick Stover, 1785 to 1866, was a successful merchant. At his death, he was buried in Section W, part of what we still call the Stover Plot. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place January 15th, 1861. We're out of our 20-year limit now, but I'm just completing the story. John J. Smith announced, "The intervening property between North and South Laurel Hill, known as Ferry Hill, the property of the late George Pepper, I am happy to say we procured. It consists of 21.5 acres. A portion of it is meadow, and this will require careful and judicious treatment to bring it into cemetery lots, but the importance of the whole tract as a connecting link to our previous grounds is so great that we have conceded very favorable terms to the heirs." Also, don't forget that Ferry Hill, that's F-A-I-R-Y, stood very close to Ferry Lane, that's F-E-R-R-Y. Now, there are 5 men named George Pepper buried at Laurel Hill East. The patriarch, George, 1779 to 1846, died and was buried before the cemetery acquired the property. So the cemetery part of Laurel Hill East, so the central part of Laurel Hill East is built around the Pepper family plot. That's just a few feet from the Warner Monument. John J. Smith's memory of the distasteful event of trying to find the resting place of a loving daughter in a watery eternal resting place had its effect on him. He managed to find property high above the Schuylkill, both sides of the Schuylkill, with excellent soil, superb drainage for his cemeteries. Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West, both founded by John J. Smith, may be the only rural garden cemeteries in the United States that do not have a lake, a pond, or even a stream. To summarize, inspired by the allegory of Old Mortality, Laurel Hill was founded in 1836 by John J. Smith and other reform-minded citizens as a response to overcrowded urban graveyards and changing attitudes towards death and memorialization. Modeled after rural cemeteries like Paris's Père Lachaise, Laurel Hill emphasized scenic landscaping, remembrance, and inclusivity for various religious and social groups, although early regulations still reflected social prejudices. The founders established distinctive rules, invested in prominent sculptures and monuments, and promoted the cemetery through celebrity corpses and innovative designs by architects such as John Notman. Laurel Hill's development mirrored broader trends in American burial practices, the rural cemetery movement, and the expansion of non-sectarian places for commemoration and education, while also sparking debates about the relationship between beauty, solemnity, and social class in cemetery culture. I talked about John Notman way back in All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 5, Building Philadelphia. Frederick Brown got his due in biographical bites from Ballad number 42, 5 Generations at Laurel Hill. The rest of this podcast will examine the lives of John J. Smith, Nathan Dunn, and Benjamin Richards.